So we will have this second panel devoted to Jewish memory in Europe. We try to have something more universalist in the first panel, but now we will go really into the bath of Jewish memory. First of all, with a communication about the Jewish museums. Everybody understands that it's an important tool to transmit, to convey something of the Jewish memory in Europe. And then we will have two other presentations that I will introduce. So the first presentation is by Laurence Sigal, who was for many years the head of the Jewish Museum in Paris, which is located not far from here, a quarter of an hour by feet. And she has been involved during many years, first in the preparations for the creation of that museum, then for its setting up, its functioning. It was something very pioneer when she did it. And she has the perspective of the years to analyze what is the Jewish Museum, what are the challenges for those who create them and for those who try to have them functioning successfully. And we asked her to analyze with her experience those very interesting questions for the vitality of Jewish culture in Europe. So Laurence, please, you have the floor for 20 or perhaps 25 minutes. It depends on the... Wait, voilà.
Thank you very much.
Here, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I feel a little bit like a Vatika, we say in Hebrew, or an old-timer. I'm very happy to be here. Actually, I have designed my presentation more as a bunch of questions than a description of what we have designed for the opening. And today, I would like to challenge the idea of memory in Jewish museum. By Jewish museum, I'm not understanding memorials or virtual museums or interactive museum, but heritage museums. So let's get back to the opening. On the evening of the museum's opening to the public in December 1998, visitors made overwhelming comments that the museum was honoring Jews, that we were doing Kiddush Hashem, meaning sanctifying God's name, so it's really heavy, and that this museum was a reparation. Some told me that they had found a house, a home, like, this is my first image, the hair of the private library of Martin Flinker, a Jew born in Czernowitz, founder of the legendary German bookstore in Paris. The term home came up again and again when people brought donations to the museum. And this happened with donation of different kinds and with people of different backgrounds. Each time, it was about objects or books that the donors had inherited. They were usually the last generation to have inherited them, sometimes since the 18th century, like the Amado family, originated from the Comtat Venessin, who gave us a gathering of objects related to the circumcision that was passed on from one generation of women to the other. Or sometimes it was even earlier than the 18th century, which was really amazing because this was not my idea of a permanent, of Jewish transmission. Here you can see a MahJ, a high holidays ritual, which was commissioned in the 15th century for a very celebrated rabbi and commentator from Spain, Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach Duran. And actually it was brought to us by the Duran family. And they had gathered and they were all crying. I mean, it was so highly emotional. We had other cases, like the donation by the heirs of a Nordman family. Their ancestors had gathered all the remnants of the synagogues in the southern Alsace. So there was not the same attachment, not the same emotion. More rarely have we received sets collected by the donor himself, except in one memorable case which had a major impact on the constitution of the collections. And I'm referring to a Boukara collection, the imposing diversity of which you will find thanks to the search engine in the museum collection database. But today with you, I'd like to return to the modalities of memory in Judaism, to the status of place and objects, and then to reflect on the possible functions of a Jewish museum in the processes of memory. I had the strong feeling then, we're back in 98 of the last century, I had the strong feeling that we were working against the clock. One of the great difficulties in setting up the museum in Paris was the fact that it was almost created against the current, against time. You remember the context? The inauguration of the museum followed the renovation of former museums like Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Prague, and others were to follow. But at the end of the 20th century, when President Chirac finally recognized the responsibility of the French state in the extermination of French Jews, the Washington agreements were also formalized exactly on the very day of the museum opening, recognizing the need to examine and repair the material spoliation, which had been still neglected in the countries whose Jewish population had suffered from the Shoah, and the pedagogical corollary. Sorry, French is coming up. Then we had entered the era of narrative roots in museum. I would like to remind you that at that time, the most popular Jewish museum was undoubtedly the Diaspora Museum Beit HaTfutzot in Israel. This museum, which was quite innovative at the time it was created, told the story of the survival of the Jewish people after the destruction of Jerusalem, celebrating its striving forces, a faithfulness to the law, study of the text, structuring of communities, and of the solidarity and maintenance of networks worldwide that linked these communities around the world. This apologetic vision also included a proud and admiring look at Jewish accomplishments in the post-emancipation era, the collapse of the Shoah, and the rebuilding of a new identity in Israel. This museum was the first one to elaborate the story and to create adequate instruments for its narrative. It told Jewish history through ideas put into images. Suddenly, we were talking about a museum journey, about narrative, whereas until now, a patrimonial conception of the museum had prevailed. So, was a new museum in France to be built on an inaccurate concept, neither Shoah nor narrative? What were the possible options? So in retrospect, and because today we want to reflect on the link between the creation of the museum, its design, and the experience of visiting it, in the light of memory, I would say that we wanted above all to show that there was something to see while the idea long told about Jewish heritage, and especially in France, was just move along, there's nothing to see. And when the Jewish Heritage Days were introduced in Europe, the museum found itself in a very special position. Elsewhere in France, in Alsace, in Provence, visits to synagogues, cemeteries, and Jewish quarters were organized. And at the beginning, the idea of heritage was mainly understood as built heritage. And I remember quite clearly designing and leading the first visits to the Jewish quarter of the MahJ on that occasion. It was an impossible and dreadful experience. It was like the stations of the cavalry. At each stop, I had to start with, once stood here such and such, but there was nothing to see anymore. Ghostly places. The medieval cemetery location, the cloister of the Billet, which had been the scene of an accusation of desecration of the host, the site of the burning of the Talmud in 1242, the area where a small number of Jews were unofficially staying in Paris before the French Revolution, and so on and so forth. There was nothing to really look at. No visible traces left. So we had to move to stories. Another point that I would like to discuss with you is the memory of migrants in memory of martyrdom, you say? Martyrdom. Voilà. This brings up to another Jewish speciality, destruction, emigration, and internal migration have most often created deserted places, desecrated places. Sometimes places have been denatured, transformed, synagogues have become libraries or garage. The heritage has been neglected, and these places are very often mute. So how can we interpret them? So I wanted to go back to Jewish matrix of memory. And I'm happy that we'll hear just after my presentation, Mrs. Garbowska. Attested at least since the Middle Ages, Jews have established a specific modality for preserving memory, the Memorbuch. This tradition probably originated with massacre perpetrated during the First Crusade in the Rhineland. There is a very large literature, abundant literature, so I don't have to go over. So this Memorbuch, in addition to the list of martyrs, included elegies, lament, and some of the lament were later incorporated in the liturgy of Yom Kippur by the survivors and way beyond. These martyrologies were followed by other works which were presented as historical writings, for example, works as the Consolação às Tribulações de Israel, which was published by Samuel Usque, about the martyrdom of Spanish Jews, published in Ferrara in 1553. Emekabacha, The Valley of Weeping, by the Avignon-born Josefa Cohen, which is a summary of the massacres compiled in 1575. But I would like also to mention the work of Nate Hanover, Yeven Metsula, The Bottom of the Abyss, on the pogroms of 1648 in the Ukraine, published in Venice in 1653. Now, looking at the role of the object in Judaism, I would like to start with an anecdote. In Genesis chapter 35, We're told that when Jacob fled with his 2 wives from the house of Laban, his uncle and father-in-law, Rachel, his beloved wife, stole her father's teraphim, meaning the penates, and concealed them. It's a very interesting story. Here is a woman called to be one of the mothers, matriarch of the Jewish people, who steals from her father, and what's more, she steals idols. And it shows us that Rachel, while she was consenting to leave her father's home, it was a very difficult uprooting, and with the theft of the objects, it showed that it was so important not only to her father, but to her. She cannot do without the markers of the family home. And this theft, bringing with you objects from a kind of abhorred place, is repeated when Hebrews leave Egypt. In Exodus chapter 12, we're told that they borrowed objects, vases, silver and gold vases, from their fellow Egyptians who consented to give them. And as you know, these objects end up very badly, because they were used to create the golden calf. So it's a kind of really heavy introduction. Objects may be poison, right? And I would like now to add something else coming from the Bible, which is, of course, not the forbidden images, but the elaboration of the tabernacle in the desert. So, first of all, God gave the permission to build a tabernacle with some holy furniture. It will be transferred to the first temple of Jerusalem, and then part of it, because the ark doesn't exist any longer, will be transferred to the second temple, and then everything disappears. So my question is, does Judaism cherish objects? I would say the contrary. To make place to memory, you have to destroy everything, because then there is a kind of work to reconstruct memory and to appropriate memory. If there's one object you refer to, it belongs to no one. And so this is very typical of Judaism. It's a migrant people connected to a vanishing world, wherever it is and whenever it is. And I would say Judaism invented the most radical dematerialization of holy places by forging the idea of minyan, which make the importance of people prevail on importance of places and objects. I have made these 2 farce detour to help us reflect on the adequacy of the museum institution with the process of active memorization, which is at the very foundation of Judaism and its culture. The injunction to remember is everywhere, from the memory of the creation of the world, to the memory of those who wanted to exterminate the Jewish people. So what have we done with these principles in the museum? How do we construct the exhibition of a culture that for centuries has been a history of perpetual displacement, of absence from the places where it developed, and of vanishing traces? Personally, I do not believe that the museum offers, as an institution, an appropriate language for implementing memory in a Jewish way, any more than I believe that the rituals of journeys to Auschwitz or pilgrimage to the graves of holy men constitute Jewish forms of the process of remembering. Nevertheless, following the Shoah, and this is a very tragic privilege, Jews have reinvented other ways of writing history, taking up the ancient form of Memorbuch, Yzkerbikher, were composed to mark the disappearance of hundreds of communities. Remembrance ceremonies with the reading of names were established, and then pedagogical journeys were instituted, memorials were created, plaques were put in France, Stolpersteine in Germany, etc., etc. So it's very interesting to see how the turning point of the Shoah made the Jewish history with the turning point of the Shoah. From this have emerged new forms of history and commemoration. What was our method? Because actually we were dealing with objects. And we decided, it's not a decision, but a kind of maxim, that the object is a speaking piece. So in the age of witnesses, objects were given the power to bear witness to the universe from which they came, and fragments of memory have been constructed around each of them, making them pretext, emblems, and revelators. We bet that these objects carry the memory of their birth context and that they have the power to awaken the memory of those who look at them, for some, or to serve the construction of a piece of knowledge for others. I voluntarily use the term of bet because except in the case of a direct belonging or a strong similarity between exposed objects and objects that the visitors have owned, the process of reminiscence cannot take place. Of course, any interaction with a museum artifact requests a narrative and a mediation. And in truth, we always deal with displaced and exiled objects. Is this a reason why Jewish object display have this common characteristic of being melancholic? Is it because the objects in a museum, unlike works of art, were designed for specific uses and are all orphaned? After all, it's a matter of perspective. Museums think that they are saving objects, collecting them and ensuring their continuity and preservation. The users, on the contrary, think that the museum is like a graveyard, a kind of open geniza. And when they enter the museum, the objects, they are condemned to be mute, to be denatured, because instead of being used, they are contemplated. And this is, believe me, a really, very often I heard that from religious people who are not regarding Jewish museum as a education tool, but as a kind of non-fitted instrument for perpetuating Judaism. Of course, the dream would be to restore the gesture, the rite, the voice, the story, but this is rarely achieved. I sincerely don't know what is being transmitted to visitors. How can one claim to transmit the memory of what one hasn't known? Museums offer tools for teaching, but not for memory. The Jewish tradition teaches procedures to awaken and keep memory alive. And the matrix of all the procedures is contained in the injunction made on the evening of Passover. And you shall tell your son on this specific day, saying, etc., etc. But the account is not your personal account. The account is formalized and standardized. And from this point of view, it's not a spontaneous and personal memory. But we have, how does it work? We have to pretend to say and to do as if we were a part of the event of, comment on dit la sortie d'Égypte? Of the Exodus, thank you. Well, and what do you say when reading the Haggadah? It reads, "This is what happened to me when I came out from Egypt." So this is a completely different reminiscence procedure. And, well, we're going to play this Exodus. The museum, regarded as a theater of which the visitors are the actors, this might sound an idea. But I will right now say the contrary. We know that the museum visitors are at best careful and attentive spectators. Every time museums have tried to involve visitors, it has generated an outcry from the critics. And I'm referring to the Holocaust Museum opening, where mainly European found that it was very manipulative. So our museum places of memories in the sense of Pierre Nora described it. Museum builds representation. They expose a project, a vision from given elements, and as such, they have authors. Until the end of the 20th century, museums were limited by their collections, and the passage to the virtual era has transformed the very idea of the museum, and today, there is no longer a need for original works to make a museum. The possibilities for storytelling are becoming almost infinite. In the case of the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, the representation of Jewish world that was proposed 25 years ago, sorry to say, was based on a classical conception of the museum in which the work of art and the object prevail. Perhaps the abolition of the boundaries between works of art, everyday objects, books, images, and documents has at best given greater freedom to the discourse than in fine art museum. It seems to me that the museum only speaks through the discourse that is grafted onto the object or the painting, and mediation is essential and indispensable. In this sense, a museum of objects is a museum of traces, but not of memory, except for the donors who have offered their history along with their gift. I could also mention that I found very satisfactory a commission which was given to the artist, late artist Christian Boltanski, who made a visual reconciliation between the place and the people in the museum. So what you see here is an installation with posters, and on the posters you have names, sometimes a profession, and a date. The date is usually the date when they were rounded up from the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, which was then a gathering of manufacturers and private apartments. And I must say I cherish this piece because instead of names on the walls, this is a very fragile work. We had to replace the posters, I think, Paul will tell me. Well, so Paul did it 5 times, and I have to add, I think, the same 5 times while I was heading the museum. And this is memory. You have to take care of it. In this sense, you are an actor of memory. If you get people to participate in the shaping of memory. I thank you.
Okay.
Tu m'entends?
Thank you very much, Laurence. I noted the words narration and mediation, which are at the core of our discussion now. We will move to the next speaker, and the questions and the discussion is at the end of the session. We will move to the next speaker, who is Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska. She is a distinguished professor in the University of Lublin in the east of Poland. You have two universities in Lublin. One is the Catholic University, and one is the Curie-Sklodowska University. This is the one where she is teaching. Originally, she taught American literature, but she discovered Yiddish in the context of American literature, and she became one of the main specialists of Yiddish in Poland today. And she will introduce us to a very interesting, very original project, how to translate the Yzkerbikher into Polish for the Polish readers of today. I think that Monika heard me. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much.
And you have about half an hour to explain us what you are doing with your teams of younger students and collaborators. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we do.
Fine. Well, I wish I could be with you in Paris, but it's a rather long way from Lublin. And besides, I'm in the middle of the examination session. So actually, after this panel, I have to go to the university to examine some students. But thank you very much for the invitation. And I am facing a very difficult task because this is a very rich topic. There are about 1,000 Jewish memorial books, and I have only half an hour, but I'll try to do my best. And I'm not sure, but maybe you've already received, or
yes.
You will receive
everybody
from the organizers
received the documentation. Yes, yes.
Prepared. It's a long handout, about 24 pages. I will not refer to it today, but I hope it will be, especially to those of you who don't know much about Jewish memorial books, it will be like a kind of reference to give you an idea what they contain. And now a few words of introduction, and then I will show you my presentation that will give you a better idea of what Yzkerbikher are. I am a literary scholar, as Philippe said, and actually I discovered Jewish culture and history via Isaac Bashevis Singer. I got interested in him in the late 70s, and then I started translating him from English into Polish, but then it kind of bothered me. I thought it was unfair to translate via English, so I learned Yiddish, and so thanks to this, I am now also able to study and translate Yzkerbikher that were predominantly published in Yiddish, Hebrew, also other languages. And I found out about Yzkerbikher a long time ago, because when you study Jewish history and culture, you can't ignore Yzkerbikher, but originally I thought they were important sources for historians, not for literary scholars. But then gradually I discovered, for example, that in the Yzkerbikher of Boukara, published in 1955, there is a text by Isaac Bashevis Singer. There is a picture of him, and actually that this book was edited by Avram Cronenberg, who was a friend of Bashevis Singer when he stayed as a teenager in Boukara. Then I got interested in literature on the Kazimierz on the Vistula, a very picturesque shtetl, not far from Lublin. And then I realized that there were lots of literary texts in that book about this shtetl. And also, kind of being the head of the department or Center for Jewish Studies, I realized how important these books were, because they give the Polish audience, the Polish readers, a completely different perspective, because they present Jewish life from inside, while most of the monographs, guidebooks that were written in Poland, especially before the fall of communism, but also later on, didn't really include so many Jewish sources. So basically, we can say that they are important for a very wide audience. They are very important for descendants, for grandchildren, now actually great-grandchildren of the people who composed them, because they talk about the Jewish communities that were destroyed during the Holocaust. They're important for all kinds of scholars, cultural historians, literary scholars, sociologists. And they are, from my perspective, they are very important for the Polish audience, although quite often they present Polish-Jewish relations in a very critical light. And sometimes these texts are difficult to kind of digest for the Polish audience, but still, I think it's very important. For example, you are all probably familiar with Jan Gross's book, The Neighbors, about a terrible pogrom in Jedwabne. So this was perceived in Poland, also in other countries, as a kind of discovery, almost an unknown thing. But actually in Yzkerbikher from that region, including the Yzkerbikher of Jedwabne, this was a thing, an event that was documented much earlier, but of course the shrinking Yiddish audience well, didn't have such a power or impact as, say, publications in English. So maybe now, not to waste time, I'll show my presentation. Can you see it well? Yeah, so I entitle it Translating Yzkerbikher for the Published Public, but I will obviously tell you more about the origin and the variety of Yzkerbikher. So here, as we had in the previous presentation, contemporary memorial books, or those published after the Holocaust, have their sources in much earlier times, in the 17th century. And here, for example, there is one of the best known Memorbücher from Frankfurt, where that records well, various important events, and also notes the people who perished, or the people who were important for the community. So actually the contemporary Yzkerbikher have their sources a few centuries ago, but in those old Memorbücher, there aren't, extensive texts as we have in the more contemporary ones. Now, these are books that were published after the First World War, after the pogroms during the First World War, and they are considered by scholars like the prototypes of the Yzkerbikher that were published after the Second World War. Because in these particular books, the editors already develop a kind of structure consisting of three parts: before the war, or before the pogrom, before the destruction, then the description of the destruction, and then what happened later. And as you see here, the word Hurben, that is Shoah in Yiddish, is used, for example, here in Hurben Proskurov, or the book in memory of the martyrs. So this is also the word that often is used, Kedoshim, the holy martyrs. And now let's kind of jump to post-war Yzkerbikher. And here, there's enormous variety of them. Here I chose some that kind of have a very typical iconography. As you see, sometimes this is the broken menorah with Jewish cemetery in the background, flames. They kind of symbolically describe the destruction of the Jewish communities. And some of them are actually of quite a high artistic value, but some of them were done by amateur artists or amateur editors. And we can generally say this about Yzkerbikher, that they are of different quality. And some historians, like for example, an eminent Jewish historian Yakov Szatsky, actually criticized Yzkerbikher because they said they are not really scholarly. They contain so many errors. They are poorly written. But actually, from the point of sociologist, cultural historian, this is also their value, that they show the emotions and the perspective of average inhabitants of these communities, although some of them were also written with the help of historians. Here is one of my favorite Yzkerbikher of Lewartov or Lubartov near Lublin. Actually, it was published in Paris because several books were published in France in 1947. And actually, I bought a copy of this book about 15 years ago when I was doing research in Medem Bibliothek. And it was very moving for me because I went to a kind of the storehouse, and there I saw a pile of these books published in 1947 in very good condition, very nicely published, but not many people were interested probably after a time in purchasing them. Here there are some other, for example, Pinkas Kremnitz. And here I show you that there are different titles. For example, the word Pinkas, the chronicle, is used, or the word Matseva. So quite often these books are compared to tombstones, that they are tombstones in words, matzevat in words, erected to the memory of the Jewish communities. Here, just another example of a book of an important Jewish community, Konin. Actually, the Jewish British writer Theo Richmond wrote a book about Konin based on this book. Here, Das Buch von Lublin. This is a book that naturally, as for me, as inhabitant of Lublin, interested me, and my colleague Adam Kopciowski actually translated a number of texts from this book. I'll show you the picture in a moment. Here, some more. This is also my discovery, that actually I discovered this book in the Library of Congress when I did when I stayed at the museum, the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this is a very small book published still in a DP camp, by a survivor, and it bears this symbolic title, Still in Rejwic. And Rejowic is a little town not far, about 50 kilometers away from Lublin, but there was this saying in Yiddish that it's a kind of God-forsaken place, a very quiet place. So you would say, oh, it's still in Rejwic. But here, this Yiddish saying acquires a different sense because it's still in Rejwic because there is no more Jewish community there. So it's quite a moving book, and published in very few copies. So it's available only in very few libraries. Here is, I don't know how visible it is on the screen. Here is a map that I did with my colleagues. Actually, it was done by a professional cartographer, and it shows Poland in pre-war borders, the Second Polish Republic, and we marked the communities that have Yzkerbikher, and it's about 650 memorial books, and some of the communities have one, but some have even five, like especially larger cities like Białystok, for example, or Częstochowa. But also some smaller communities like Boukara, for example, has two books. Sometimes they were done by various competing groups, for example, Zionists and Bundists, that they wanted to show their perspective on the towns. Here, in many Yzkerbikher were done with the help of Jewish associations, grouping people who came from those towns. And this is, for example, Krzemieniec Landsmannschaft. Quite often these Landsmannschaften collected money for the publication of the books. So here again, so quite often this was, sometimes like in this book of Rejowiec, it was just one person who did it. And sometimes this was a large organization. Here, some of the books contain a table of contents both in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. For example, this is from the book of Helm. And this is a very interesting story because Helm, also not that far from Lublin, functions in Yiddish culture as the town of sages, or actually fools, or differently wise. And here, this was a very important large community. And what's interesting is that this book was published in Johannesburg in South Africa, although there were big Jewish associations, of Helm Jewish associations in Israel and in New York, but there the editors say this is also a Helm story, that we, a small community in Johannesburg, were able to publish this magnificent book, and those large associations in New York or Tel Aviv didn't do this. Here, for example, there is a kind of beautiful picture by a well-known artist, Chaim Goldberg, who came from Kazimierz on the Vistula, Kuzmir, and illustrated this book. So here's an example of a professional artist cooperating with the editors. And basically here, like a quick look what you can find in Yzkerbikher. You can find lots of photographs of people who perished, and their families, if they had some photographs, they would try to incorporate them into the books to commemorate their families. Here, for example, there are such obituaries in very characteristic that kind of tombstones, graphic tombstones, incorporating some photographs, names, and sometimes short description. Often, here is this from this book of Lubartov that I bought in Paris, survivors. Quite often, the people who survived, who returned for a short while to a community, would take the picture and include in the book. This is what's fascinating about Yzkerbikher: maps, plans drawn from memory. And there are hundreds of them. And what is interesting is that, here's another one, that this is a kind of Jewish personal, sometimes even personal individual topography. So these maps may differ quite substantially from real topography or this kind of mainstream topography, but they are very interesting because they show how the Jewish part of the town, or even include some names that were used only in Yiddish, not in Polish. Here's another one. Sometimes they kind of note every single house. You can find also in Yzkerbikher some documents. You can find notes to songs. So actually they are also quite interesting for musicologists. You can find also linguists, lots of expressions. Here's some posters, some photographs from after the war, from abandoned, deserted communities. Actually, this is the topic that interests me most, and I've written quite a lot on these returns of survivors, how they, those who survived, for example, in the Soviet Union or in a camp, and then return to those communities in the 1945, 1946, and what they see, how they are perceived by their neighbors. And now, switching to this kind of Polish reception, this is a picture from our Center for Jewish Studies. It shows some books that we collected. We have some originals, but also a number of off-prints that we purchased at the Yiddish Book Center at Amherst. Now, most of the books are available in digital form on the page of the New York Public Library. So not all of them, but a number of them. So if some of you would like to look at them, you can just write New York Public Library, Yzkerbikher, and you can look, read all of them. And you can do the same via Yiddish Center at Amherst. Here also, this is a page from Jewish Gen that probably a number of you are familiar with, where there is a big, very important initiative of translating these books into English, but I am very much against translating via an intermediary language. So in case of Polish translation, I insist of translating from the original, because lots of these translators who translate from Yiddish or Hebrew into English don't know Polish or Ukrainian. And so they distort lots of expressions. And here some of the publication that preceded our publication. So there is this important book that you probably know in French by Annette Wiewiórka, Itzhak-Niborski, Le Livre de Souvenirs. This is quite an early publication, and here from a Ruined Garden, the English publication. And this is the here the books that we published at our center. And the most important is this one, the anthology. I can show it to you. It's quite a thick book. The title is My Home Used to Be There, and it contains about 200 texts from Yzkerbikher. And our idea was that we publish this anthology, and this will stimulate interest in Yzkerbikher. And actually, now there is a whole trend. It's a kind of almost mushrooming. Lots of regional historians in different communities got interested in this, and they are trying to publish either the whole translations or fragments. And here there are some examples. For example, this is the one of the Boukara books. Actually, this is the one that inspired me because that I mentioned, because it was done in collaboration with Isaac Bashevis-Singer. Here, this is a selection of texts from Lublin book done by my colleague Adam Kopciowski. Here's some other example, Pinkas Szczekocin. For example, this Pinkas Szczekocin, a whole translation. Here we have Sochachev, Pinkas Sochachev. It's a very long book, so the editors decided only upon a selection of text. And here some of the most recent ones, the book of Sefer Pruszków, Sefer Bielsk Podlaski, and actually these books were published without any omissions. Yes, so here, I don't know if I have any time still or... Yes, to conclude. So, so now the main question, why? Because I said they are important for various groups, but why are they important for the Polish audience? Because they, as I mentioned, they show the Jewish perspective. They also let people know about the variety, the richness of Jewish life, because a problem with commemoration or Jewish memory in Poland is that quite often people in some small towns or even larger cities like Lublin, for example, or Białystok, they know that there was a Jewish community, that something terrible happened that during the Holocaust, but they know very little about the richness of Jewish life. How and actually, I think it's very important if some of them try to discover some important figures, for example, some important writers or politicians who came from those communities. For example, when I participated in this publication of the book of Sochachev, I discovered that a very important Jewish writer, Oyzer Warszawski, who actually spent quite a long time in France and was deported then from France to Auschwitz during the war, came from Sochachev. So I actually encouraged the editors of this Pinkas or Sefer Sochachev to publish a book, Smugglers, the Smugglers, by Warszawski. Actually, there's a very good French translation of this book, and while translating this book from Yiddish into Polish, I also consulted sometimes the French version. So there is like a chain of interest in a sense. For example, in case of this book of Sochachev, that first the local readers were exposed to some very fascinating sources about, for example, the religious life, political life in that town. And then it led to another initiative, like introducing this particular writer. And I could, tell you dozens of such stories. Of course, there are some communities that are not interested in that. There is a certain barrier, a certain psychological barrier that they, but there are some that are very open and that learn quite a lot this way.
Monika, I think that everybody learned from your presentation.
And of course, I'll be very happy to answer.
In about 20-25 minutes, we will open the discussion. Many people have very superficial opinions about Poland and anti-Semitism. It's important to know that many people who are non-Jewish in Poland work on Jewish culture in a very delicate and very creative way, and you summarize it very well. Huh? So let us hear now Leopold Braunstein, who for many years was the president of the Medem Center in Paris, and he will introduce us to a project that is connected to the UNESCO, to international organizations, to have immaterial Jewish cultural patrimony recognized as such by the international organizations. Leo, please.
Hi, Ava is mir, ich bin Chinese gid, which means I don't feel very good. For, as you know, Kohelet, but only the Yiddish version of Kohelet, there is a time to lament and a time to lament. Well, having been able to express without constraints my Ashkenazi complaint and the holiday of Purim being just the opposite of the eternal pain that overwhelms us, now let us be cheerful, joyful, cool. Do not try to remember if you turn off the gas before leaving home this morning, or to remind with anxiety where the hell you left your car keys while thinking that some bad guys for sure are forcing you home today. So we are safe in a gorgeous place, peaceful together, ready to learn about a crazy wired process called the Purimspiel project, led by a collective, a bunch of associations called in French Collectif Purimspiel, le Collectif Purimspiel. And that idea emerged in 2008, some 15 years after the Vilnius International Colloquium on Yiddish. It was around this time in a meeting of the Medem Center, which I was a member, that someone said at the turn of a sentence, well, could Yiddish, this European and transnational language, be recognized as part of the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage, ICH in English, PCI in French? Immediately, I felt the danger in my bones. At this time, I was the president of the Medem Center, and I knew that this project would involve a lot of works and sweat, perhaps tears, hours and hours of meetings, writings, gathering, and so on. I replied, that's a very interesting idea, but by the way, didn't you forget to turn off the gas before leaving home this morning? And do you remember where you put your car keys? But it didn't work. A few years later, in 2012, after 2 years of work, There was a first launch in front of 100 persons from different institutions, but when we contacted the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage in France, we were told, and this was very disappointing, very discouraging, that Yiddish is not eligible. Farvus nicht? Why not? Well, because all languages have genus, and all of them, about 7,000 in the world, are part of the universal heritage of humanity. Too much. Therefore, none can be recognized. So we had to be cunning and still work to find something else to honor Yiddish and Yiddishkeit. The theme of Purimspiel emerged among many proposals, researches, and discussions that lasted still more than 1 year, including 6 months to find out whether it's better to write Purim with a U, like in English, or a U, like in French, and whether to write it in italics, in one word, or two, with 5 organizations working together with 2 or 3 delegates at each meeting. You could imagine what it was like. Spiel, on the other hand, was sneezed much more simply in the Yiddish way. Everybody, of course, knows about the holiday of Purim. It's a slaughter that didn't happen for once. But let's take a quick look at what Rachel Hertel writes about it. This celebration, quote, played a primordial role in the birth of Yiddish theater. The celebration, which takes place on the 14th of Adar, invites transgressions and games on identity and the inversion of social hierarchies and the widespread use of masks. Therein lies, in the very matrix of Yiddish theater, the Purimspiel. The repertoire initially includes the representation of the Esther Scroll, which variation by 1 or more actors. Subsequently, the repertoire of the Purimspiel diversified to include other biblical episodes. For example, the sale of Joseph, David and Goliath in the 18th century, the sacrifice of Isaac, Hannah and Permina, the wisdom of Solomon in the 19th and 20th century. If the Purimspiel offers variant and improvisations in its contents and text, on the other hand, its structure has 3 moments: the prologue, blessing of the spectators, summary of the play, presentation of the actors, action, which tells the story of Esther Scroll or another episode from the Bible, finally the epilogue, new blessings, and codified request and rhyming reward. The Purimspiel embodies a certain number of typical characters from the tradition who are similar in many respects to those of the Commedia dell'arte, the Italian Commedia dell'arte, the Letz or Marchalik, the playmaker, the Läufer and the Payats, respectively messenger and clown. They are mixed with the heroes of the story depicted in caricature of members of the community, especially notables. Comic elements, obscenities, erotic allusion pepper the representation. The game is at once declamatory, excessive in gestures, and embellished with dance, song, and musical interludes. A word about Esther and the Purimspiel. Is it true? It is true that the filiation of this heroine, Esther, is not very clear. We do not know if Mordechai is his cousin, his uncle, in any case, his breadwinner, not to say his pimp. I say that because we find all the versions in the theater pieces that take up this event with all the possible interpretation. And this from the first Purimspiel, which has come down to us entirely, named Ashverosh play of 1697 that Nathan Weistock translated in 2015 as a support of our action. The main goal of the collective Purimspiel remained to be recognized as part of the IHC. As far as the project is concerned, to succeed, it must be recognized as part of the cultural heritage of the community that creates, maintains, and transmits it. Contribute to cultural identity, and be alive in many parts of the world. Be regularly practiced, recreated, and learned from one generation to the next. Now, some examples that the collective had made possible. First, the translation of Yzkerbikher's Megillah, edited with translation in French, music sheet, and translation of the accompanying libretto. It was performed in 2015. A big evening called Asterix Crazy Night. Several clips of Purimspiel, including one of the association Bet Avrim called The Queens of Purim. You can see it on the internet. The translation of the first complete Purimspiel, as mentioned before, by Nathan Weistock. Laurent Berger's silent film Esther from Yzkerbikher, a 40-minute film, presented many times, once in Brussels, at the CLCG. This film contains certain audacities, but remains actually very timorous compared to everything that has been written and already exists. The slideshow that will follow provides a quick overview of what has already been done and what remains to be done. So I tried to launch it.
Gott soll auch befreien in dieser schweren Zeit. guten Abend, Prinzen, Grafen, Damen, Kavalieren.
Zoek nog, dokter, die weiß, kommst du sie willst.
Was er will?
Ja.
Mein liebster Philippe. Äußeres als Schieres muss teugen. Als wir nach seinem Zimmer zu meinen liebsten Qualen geflogen. Über ihre Tod.
Muss nach Heire, was er kommen so viel.
Toch, Esther, hersen op de kisten. Esther, chi.
In Dreußen is a Regen, in Dreußen is a Wind, in Dreußen is a Wind. Der Wind soll man durch und auf der Weg geschwind, und der Weg geschwind. Und ungesorgt nicht Sure, der Wetter in der Wein, der Vetter hat a Heuker, und auch der Brüder.
Esther, ich begehre.
Vater König, ich Herr. Und hat sie unter Kusch sich, bis er Säger zwei, und sie wird am Schlafen treuer.
Ja, dehors s'écoule le vent, dehors s'écoule le vent. Si ça j'étais le vent, il serait déjà parti, il serait déjà parti. Racontez la nouvelle à l'oncle bien-aimé. Il a une bosse sur l'aile, un sourcil brûlé. In Dreußen is a Regen, in Dreußen is a Wind, in Dreußen is a Wind. Der Wind verlockt Zeichen und der Weg geschwind, und der Weg geschwind.
Puisque c'est pourri, mais chantons, célébrons la fête et surtout jouons de la crémelle, Dame Greiger Dreyen. Sein zufrieden, sie sei Jontef, ein Verjeden. Purim, 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 Purim. Singt ein Liederle für Purim, singt ein Liederle für Purim, singt ein Liederle für Purim, ein Liederle für Purim. Ai, 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 ai,
Et bonne chance avec cette jolie, magnifique projet. Ça va être une grande image importante dans le monde entier, que le yiddish va être dans l'UNESCO, qu'on va honorer notre culture si chère, qu'on va être dans la paix ensemble, en chantant, en tanzendig, singendig. Lass mir singen, Brüder, gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, es ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, es ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen, Lieder, und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, es ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen, Lieder, und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Lach, jeder noch lach. Jontefel Nacht, ins kindergedenkende Nest. Singt brüderlich, singt, tanzt fröhlich und springt, dem teilen Tag nicht vergesst. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus.
Merci à tous, merci à tous. Rejoignez notre projet.
Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus. Heint ist Purim, Brüder, das ist ein Jont auf Kreuz. Lass mir singen Lieder und gehen von Haus zu Haus.
Thank you very much, Leo. And you understand that there is a need now to extend the project to various countries in order to obtain the final recognition by the UNESCO. I think that we may take 5 to 10 minutes for an exchange with you in the room, with Monika in Lublin and our two lecturers here. Huh? So the floor is yours. Yeah.
Hello, thanks. Is it on? Yeah. Thanks very much for these very interesting presentations. I just want a couple comments regarding the Purimspiel. Has any research been done, sort of comparison between Purimspiel and other things like the holiday pantomime in England, which is a similar type of stuff like that? And would there be sort of the possibility of putting them all together because there are links between them, at least in the performance way? As for memory, it sounds to me like from the presentations and from all of our other discussions, we're dealing with a lot of different words, at least in English, and I can throw out a lot of them. Memory, memories, plural, memorials, recall, remembering, recollection, recording, reportage, contemporary history, perception, storytelling, and things like this. And I think that they all may come under an umbrella which would encompass everything and sort of not have to differentiate between all these different facets. And as for museums and other things, can't objects be anchors or triggers for memory? They don't necessarily mean memory themselves, because what can we remember physically that we don't actually have experienced? How can we remember? You know, there are a lot of Holocaust memorials that just say remember, but how can you remember something that you don't know what it is? But objects can be anchors or triggers for memories, remembering, recollections, and I think this is where their importance can come in to lead back or create an anchor or a spark for this type of storytelling or remembering or history taking.
Okay, we may have a few questions. It would be more efficient. Please.
Yeah, for Madame Sigal, talking about object and things and the story that they tell, you know, in Hebrew, words have roots that usually they mean the same thing. So the word for thing in Hebrew is davar, and it's no wonder that it comes from the root ledaber, to speak, because maybe they cannot speak, but we, the people, are speaking the story of what it is that they tell us. So this is one of the dilemmas that you had with the objects and how can they be a source for memory. And I just wanted to say for Professor Garbowska, it was very, very interesting to see the work that you have done with the memorial books. Just a little note, the Library of Izmir, with which I've been working from the Rabbinic Library of Izmir and some of the items of the Geniza, we found also many little booklets with memorial prayers and list of people that were listed in those booklets that also tell us a lot about the Sephardic and the community of the Jews of Izmir. So you did an amazing job, and we are hoping to be able to do the same thing with what we found in the town of Izmir in Turkey.
Yes, yes, I can hear. Mhm.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Is it my turn? Yes. I just wanted to share an experience we have created in Geneva at the Jewish community. There is an association called Second Generation, and we welcome them in our premises. And every month they gather people who share the condition of a second generation of Holocaust survivors. Gather there, and they share experiences. And little by little, a project emerged. We asked people to testify and share their family experiences, but also to bring a specific object which for them conveys this history. So it's very interesting. We created a new word in the French language, transmissionnel. It's an object which has this purpose. It's a psychological. It has a psychological. It's a psychological tool to help people testify about the history of their own family, and it has created and we have gathered those testimonies and made picture of the person as the person is actually giving the testimony, holding the object, and it's really very powerful. It was published. It was published. It's a very nice book that with a foreword by great specialists such as Boris Cyrulnik and other people, and I think it's a very innovative way of making this building a bridge between the object which is in museums. Objects quite often they don't carry this memory. That's what you've been emphasizing in your speech, and this is a very interesting way of giving a new importance to the object. And as a carrier as a tool of carrier of memory.
Thank you. The last question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, what I want to say is kind of a follow-up to the question that was just posed, because I personally, again, it tackles the issue of objects. I was personally very inspired by a concept of material witness. It was a book published a couple of years ago by a British scholar, and she talks about how when we don't have living witnesses, objects can work as material witnesses, especially with the development of new technologies that allow us to investigate objects as evidence more and more in detail. And I wonder whether you see some potential in that. I personally was involved in a project with a colleague of mine, Natalia Romik. We were investigating wartime Jewish hideouts, and we were using different technologies to actually read certain informations that are actually in the objects themselves, the way they were used, where they were stored, and there's more and more knowledge that we can gain from the objects themselves so that they become sort of material witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you. I may say that your questions are more remarks than questions, so we will not have a lot to say as answers, but I will leave the floor to the three lecturers. I would just want to observe that it's important to have a balance between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic components of our Jewish world. And I would say that in Algeria, there is one specific community, which is the Tlemcen community, which has the reputation of being very cultured, very well educated in the Jewish education, more than the average level of Algerian Jewry. And in Tlemcen, there are 4 Yzkerbikher that have been written by members of the community in French, but with plenty of documents and photographs. Probably they didn't know that in the Yiddish-speaking world there were such a thing as the Yzkerbikher, but they had the same intuition, and they produced it in France in the last 30 years. So I leave Monika make her remarks, and then Laurence and Leo, and we will have the coffee break. Monika, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so of course the concept of memorial book is very wide, and here I focus on this, especially Polish communities, but there are numerous books that cover, various communities, and actually this is the process that it's still being continued because they are translated, and in these translations there are some additional modern material added, and that's what you, Philippe, mentioned about these books in French, or the kind of post-memorial books. So this is the process that continues, and actually it depends how we define them, because if we define them in a very strict sense, we would define an ErgCord book as the one that has, let's say, a collective voice. But of course we can take a more flexible formula, and some scholars, for example, include some individual memoirs also to this genre. But just 2 short comments, because I assume that most of the public is in French-speaking public. So I just want to show this book that you might know. This was the special edition published in 2014, Le Shoah dans le livre de souvenirs. And actually it contains our publications done in Polish, translated into French. So it also kind of shows this, how it's kind of circulates, that we were inspired to some extent by Annette Wiewiórka and Itzhak Niborski, and now our publications kind of attracted interest in France. And one last thing, talking about this, about this chain of research. 3 years ago, I translated a book from Yiddish by Mordecai Zanin, Über Stein und Stock. This is a reportage of a Jewish journalist visiting Poland in 1946-1947 and visiting 100 destroyed communities. And actually, I discovered Zanin via fragments from Yzkerbikher, because in a number of Jewish memorial books, fragments of his reportage were published. And surprisingly, this book, although it's very difficult for the Polish public, because he presents a very critical image of, Poles and their response to the Holocaust after the war, was very well received in Poland. I expected that there would be maybe some criticism that here there is this Jewish journalist and presenting, let's say, Poland in such a bad light, but it's such a moving book, and it's written right after the war, that So a number of people, even the reviewers, said, well, what Jan Gross told us 20 years ago, actually Mordecai Zanin did 70 years ago. But of course, in those circumstances, this book couldn't have been published. So there are lots of these things that come with a long delay. So it's a continuing process.
Thank you very much, Monika. A few words of conclusion by Laurence and then by Leo, please.
Thank you, Philippe. I'm aware that my speech was a little provocative, and now I would like to correct my point of view as a museum professional, a secular museum professional. Of course, I'm a strong believer in the power of objects. Otherwise, I would haven't done what I've done. I just wanted to stress, to emphasize that it's not a Jewish way to rely on objects. I'm really, really disturbed by the new ways, and I'm sorry to say that here, but pilgrimage to the places where the Jewish people have been murdered is exactly contrary to the full Jewish traditions. And no one knows where Moses has been buried. And this should be meaningful for us. When Jews were expelled from Spain, rabbis in Amsterdam forbade them to go back. So I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm saying that it's not part of the Jewish tradition. And the same for museum. I think it was a full privilege. I loved what I've done, and I hope that we've been successful. And I strongly believe in the power of objects again. But this is not our memory. We are proceeding to new ways of enhancing memory, and I'm sorry to say so. I understand the idea of umbrella, but we have to stick to words. And memory is one word, remembrance is another word, and teaching is another word. So just step back and think about it. Maybe we won't change what we do, but I strongly feel that we have to think it over twice.
Okay, thank you. And Leo?
Some words, or just some words. As you could see, I'm not filled with nostalgia. I think that Purim is a feast very interesting because it's a slaughter that, as I said, it's not been done. So it's cheerful, joyful, and it's still alive. You know, for example, the carnival in Tel Aviv or in London, and it's the occasion of meeting association and to work together. So, if I'm very open to any opportunities to explain and to work with other associations to build something. The Yiddish is just something to protect and to celebrate, and this is something living. So.
Okay, thank you very much. So in a few days we will have an occasion to celebrate Purim, and now we celebrate the coffee break, which is quite short, but quarter of an hour of coffee break.